There is a version of the Cold War that most people carry in their minds like a kind of received wisdom. It goes something like this. Two superpowers glared at each other across a geopolitical divide for about 4 decades, spent extraordinary amounts of money building weapons they never used, and then one day, more or less peacefully, one side simply stopped. The Soviet Union dissolved, the wall came down, and the world exhaled. That version is not exactly wrong, but it leaves out almost everything that actually happened. What actually happened was a continuous sequence of near catastrophes. Each one managed just barely well enough that no one outside a small circle of officials ever learned it had occurred. What actually happened was the construction of systems so elaborate, so layered with redundancy and protocol and automated response, that the humans inside them gradually became less like decision makers and more like observers of a process that had already decided. What actually happened was that the planet came within minutes, sometimes within seconds, of a nuclear exchange on multiple occasions, and the reason it did not happen was rarely wisdom, rarely statesmanship, and almost never the result of systems working as designed. Most of the time it was something much smaller. A man who hesitated, a technician who questioned a reading, a colonel who decided, against every protocol he had ever been trained to follow, that he was not going to make the call. This is the story of that hesitation. But to understand what it meant, you have to understand the world that made it necessary. And that world did not begin with missiles. It began with a question that no government in the nuclear age has ever been willing to answer honestly. How do you build a system that will definitely launch if it needs to, and definitely not launch if it does not need to, when the difference between those two situations might be indistinguishable in the moment you have to decide? The answer, it turned out, was that you could not. You could only build systems that made one kind of error less likely by making the other kind more likely. You could tighten the triggers and risk accidental launch. You could loosen the triggers and risk paralysis in a real attack. Every design choice was a trade-off, and every trade-off was managed by the same institution that created the problem in the first place. A military bureaucracy operating under conditions of extreme secrecy, with no external accountability, inside a political system that treated the acknowledgement of mistakes as a form of treason. That is the environment in which Stanislav Petrov worked, and that is the environment in which, on the night of September 26, 1983, he made a decision that the Soviet military would spend the next several years trying to erase from the historical record. To understand September 26, 1983, you have to understand the particular texture of that moment in the Cold War. It was not a random point on a timeline of steady tension. It was a moment when the system was already under strain in ways that were not fully visible even to the people inside it. The year had begun with a deployment decision. NATO had announced that it would station American Pershing II ballistic missiles in West Germany, and the Soviet military establishment had spent months analyzing what that meant. The Pershing II was a medium-range missile with a flight time to Moscow of approximately 6 to 10 minutes, depending on the launch site. That was not much time. In the existing Soviet command structure, it was not clear that a meaningful response could even be authorized in 6 minutes. The Pershing deployment was understood in Moscow not as a military balance, but as a potential decapitation threat, a system that could destroy the Soviet leadership before it had time to respond. The Soviet response to this concern was not diplomatic. It was institutional. Throughout 1981 and into 1983, the KGB and Soviet military intelligence ran an operation called Ryan, which stood for Raketno-Yadernoye Napadenie, or nuclear missile attack. Ryan was a global intelligence gathering program designed to provide early warning of an American first strike. It tasked Soviet agents around the world with monitoring specific indicators: blood bank activity, the movement of military vehicles, the lighting patterns in government buildings at night, the purchasing patterns for certain categories of civilian goods that historically preceded wartime mobilization. The underlying logic was that an American first strike would require preparation, and preparation would leave traces, and those traces could be detected if you knew where to look. The problem with Ryan was not its ambition. The problem was its epistemology. It was a system designed to find evidence of something that its designers already believed was coming. The analysts feeding information into Ryan were not evaluating whether an attack was likely. They were evaluating how close an attack that was already assumed to be in preparation might be. Every piece of ambiguous information was filtered through that prior assumption, and ambiguous information under those conditions tends to confirm what you already believe. By the fall of 1983, Ryan had been running for 2 years, and it had produced a picture of the world that was significantly more alarming than the world as it actually existed. Soviet leadership had been receiving assessments throughout the year suggesting that American intentions were aggressive in ways that Western observers would not have recognized. The rhetoric coming from Washington did not help. Ronald Reagan had described the Soviet Union as an evil empire in March of that year. He had announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a missile defense program that Soviet analysts interpreted not as a defensive measure, but as a first strike enabler, a shield that would allow the United States to absorb a Soviet retaliatory strike after launching its own. The logic was adversarial, but not irrational. A missile defense system only changes the balance of power if one side already intends to strike first. Then, on September 1st, 1983, a Soviet interceptor aircraft shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 over the Sea of Japan, killing all 269 people on board. The plane had drifted into Soviet airspace, and the military response was to destroy it. The international reaction was severe. Reagan called it a crime against humanity. The United States and its allies imposed sanctions. The Soviet military initially refused to acknowledge what had happened, and then, when the evidence became undeniable, defended the shoot-down as a necessary response to a spy mission. The KAL-007 incident did not increase the likelihood of nuclear war in any direct sense, but it dramatically increased the temperature of the relationship between the two superpowers at exactly the moment when Ryan was producing its most alarming assessments. And it created a political environment in which the Soviet military, already convinced that an American first strike was being prepared, had reason to believe that the Americans would interpret any Soviet mistake as confirmation of their own adversarial assumptions. This is the world Stanislav Petrov occupied on the night of September 26, 1983. Petrov was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces. He was not, in the traditional sense, a frontline officer. He was a systems analyst, a man whose job was to sit at a monitoring station and evaluate the outputs of the Soviet early warning satellite network. The station he worked at that night was called Serpukhov 15, located about 60 miles south of Moscow. Its function was to receive data from the Oko satellite constellation and interpret it, to determine in real time whether the signals coming in from orbit represented an actual missile launch or a false alarm. On paper, this sounds like a job that requires technical training and careful attention. In practice, it was something more existential than that. The Oko system had been designed with a specific operational doctrine in mind. If the satellites detected a launch, the duty officer at Serpukhov 15 was required to report it up the chain of command. That report would then be evaluated, and if it was confirmed, it would trigger a response. The response, in the event of a confirmed American first strike, was a retaliatory launch. The entire process, from satellite detection to launch authorization, was designed to take minutes, not hours. Minutes. The reasoning behind that design was sound, in its way. A nuclear exchange fought with ballistic missiles would be decided in the first 30 minutes. If the Soviet command structure waited for certainty before responding, it might wait until there was nothing left to respond with. The system was built for speed, and speed required that the humans in it function as efficiently as possible, which meant following protocols, relaying information, and trusting the system's outputs, rather than second-guessing them. Petrov understood all of this. He had helped design parts of the system he now monitored. He knew its logic from the inside, and he knew also from the inside its limitations. At approximately midnight, Moscow time, the alarm sounded. The Oko satellite network reported a missile launch from the continental United States. Then a second, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. 5 missiles. The system was reporting 5 inbound intercontinental ballistic missiles launched from American territory, heading toward the Soviet Union. What happened in the next few minutes is a matter of some historical record, though the full details did not become public for years, and the Soviet military did its best to ensure they never became public at all. What Petrov later described was a mental process that unfolded under conditions that were, by any objective measure, extraordinarily difficult. He looked at the system output, 5 missiles. The protocol was clear: report the launch immediately, initiate the chain of verification, allow the command structure to make the decision. That was his job. That was what the system expected him to do. He did not do it. Instead, he began to evaluate the information against what he knew about American doctrine, about Soviet sensor capabilities, and about the specific technical characteristics of the Oko system. And what he found, as he examined the data in those first few minutes, was a series of small inconsistencies that did not add up to certainty, but added up to doubt. The first thing he noticed was the number: 5 missiles. If the United States were actually launching a first strike against the Soviet Union, the operational doctrine was not ambiguous. An American first strike would involve hundreds of missiles, perhaps thousands of warheads. The entire logic of nuclear strategy as it had developed over the previous 3 decades was based on the concept of overwhelming retaliation. You launch so many weapons that even if some of them are intercepted or destroyed on the ground, enough survive to eliminate the target's military capacity. 5 missiles was not a first strike. 5 missiles was, by the standards of nuclear strategy, essentially nothing. It would destroy specific targets, but it would not prevent retaliation. It made no strategic sense. The second thing he noticed was the confidence level of the system. The Oko network was designed to report launches with a confidence rating, a measure of how certain the satellite data was. The confidence rating on this alert was not at the highest level. The system was reporting a launch, but it was not reporting it with the degree of certainty that the protocols said should precede escalation. The third thing he noticed was the absence of corroborating data. The Soviet early warning architecture included ground-based radar systems in addition to the satellites. Those radar systems should, if missiles were actually inbound, begin detecting them within a certain time frame. In those first few minutes, the ground radar was showing nothing. That absence was not conclusive. It could mean the missiles were not there. It could also mean the radar had not yet acquired them. But it was one more piece of information that did not fit the picture of an actual American launch. None of these observations gave Petrov certainty. He did not know in those minutes that the alert was a false alarm. He suspected it. He calculated that it was more likely to be an error than a real event. But the system he was monitoring was not designed to distinguish between near certainty and absolute certainty. It was designed to report and then let others decide. He chose not to report it as a confirmed launch. The false alarm, it was later determined, had been caused by a rare combination of factors involving the Molniya orbit of the satellite, the angle of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, and the specific geometry of the satellite's position relative to the Minuteman missile fields in North Dakota. The satellite had interpreted a reflection as a launch plume. The system software had done what it was designed to do, which was to detect a launch signature and report it. The humans in the loop had not caught the error before it reached Petrov's console. What would have happened if Petrov had followed protocol is a question that admits of no certain answer. The Soviet military at that time had a policy that was, at least in some formulations, close to what strategists call launch on warning. The doctrine that a retaliatory strike should be initiated based on warning data before incoming weapons actually arrive, to prevent the destruction of the retaliatory capability. If Petrov had reported the launch, it would have gone up the chain of command. Whether that chain of command would have authorized an actual retaliatory strike is unknowable. But the chain would have been initiated. The process would have begun. What Petrov's hesitation did, at minimum, was prevent that process from beginning. It kept the decision at his level rather than elevating it. And in doing so, it introduced into the system exactly the kind of human judgment that the system had been designed in many ways to eliminate. The Soviet military's response to Petrov's actions was not gratitude. It was not initially anything official at all. His actions were investigated, and he was reprimanded, not for his decision, but for the administrative failures in his log. He had not filled out the paperwork correctly during the incident because he was occupied with the actual incident. He was later reassigned. His story did not become public for many years, and when it did, it was through his own account, not through any official acknowledgement. The Soviet military's reluctance to celebrate what Petrov had done was not arbitrary. It was the logical consequence of what his actions implied. If Petrov had done the right thing, then the system he had overridden was capable of triggering a nuclear war by mistake. That was not a conclusion the institution was prepared to accept on the record. But Petrov's case, as significant as it was not unique. It was not even the most dangerous near miss of that particular year. Less than 2 months later, in November 1983, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise was designed to simulate a coordinated nuclear release, a rehearsal of the procedures that would be followed if NATO decided to use nuclear weapons in response to a Soviet conventional attack in Europe. It was the most realistic simulation of nuclear war procedures that NATO had ever conducted, and it included for the first time senior political leadership from participating nations. Soviet intelligence was watching Able Archer closely. The exercise looked, to the analysts running Ryan, almost exactly like what Ryan had been designed to detect. Aircraft were moving. Communications were changing. The exercise used authentic command procedures and authentic radio traffic. Soviet military intelligence could not definitively determine whether Able Archer was an exercise or a cover for an actual attack. Several Soviet intelligence officers later reported that their superiors had concluded, at various points during the exercise, that an actual nuclear strike might be imminent. Soviet nuclear forces were, according to some accounts, brought to a higher state of readiness during Able Archer. Some Warsaw-Pact air units in Eastern Europe were placed on alert. The exercise ended without incident because it was, in fact, an exercise. But the gap between an exercise and an incident, during those 2 weeks in November 1983, was not obvious to everyone observing it. It was only later, after American intelligence agencies received reports about the Soviet reaction to Able Archer, that the Reagan administration began to understand how close the world had come to an unintentional escalation driven entirely by miscommunication. Robert Gates, who was deputy CIA director at the time and later wrote about the episode, described his own reaction to the intelligence assessments as a genuine shock. The Americans had not intended to signal aggression. They had been conducting what they understood as a routine, if ambitious, military exercise. The Soviets had understood something different. This gap in understanding, this fundamental failure of each side to correctly read the other's intentions, was not a bug in the Cold War system. It was a feature. It was built into the architecture of deterrence itself. The logic of deterrence, as it developed in the 1950s and 1960s, rested on a specific theoretical foundation: that each side's knowledge of the other's retaliatory capability would prevent either side from striking first. If you know that a first strike will be met with a devastating response, you will not strike first. The stability of the system depended on each side having accurate information about the other's capabilities and credible belief in the other's willingness to use them. But accurate information about nuclear capabilities was precisely what both sides worked most intensively to deny to each other. The entire apparatus of military secrecy, of deception programs, of the PSYOP and its Soviet equivalents was devoted to preventing the adversary from knowing exactly what you had and exactly how you intended to use it. You wanted your enemy to believe you were capable of a devastating retaliatory strike. You did not want your enemy to know enough about your actual forces to calculate whether a first strike might successfully destroy them before they could be launched. This meant that both sides were making their strategic decisions based on incomplete and often deliberately distorted information about each other's actual capabilities. And both sides built their systems, their protocols, their launch doctrines to function under those conditions of uncertainty. The result was a set of institutions that were simultaneously designed to prevent catastrophe and structurally incapable of guaranteeing it. The early warning satellite program that Petrov monitored was a direct product of this dynamic. The Soviets had built the OCO system because they needed to know as early as possible if an American strike was coming. The Americans had built their own early warning systems for the same reason. Each system was designed to detect the other side's missiles with enough lead time to allow a retaliatory response. Each system was, by design, operating at the edge of its technical capability, monitoring signatures that were ambiguous, processing data in real time under conditions that did not permit extended deliberation. The technical failures that produced false alarms were not rare. They were a documented feature of every early warning system deployed during the Cold War. The American early warning system generated its own list of near catastrophes, and several of them came from sources that seem almost comic in retrospect, though they were anything but comic in the moment. In November 1979, a technician at the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, inserted a training tape into the operational computer system. The tape was a simulation of a large-scale Soviet nuclear attack. For approximately 6 minutes, the NORAD command post, along with the National Military Command Center in Washington and the underground command post at Offutt Air Force Base, received data indicating that Soviet missiles were inbound. Airborne command posts were launched. Missile crews were alerted. The alert was terminated when ground-based radars failed to confirm the attack. The total time from alarm to resolution was, by various accounts, between 3 and 6 minutes. Less than a year later, in June 1980, the same NORAD command post received an alert indicating that 2 Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missiles had been launched. Then the alert changed. 220 missiles. Then more. Airborne command posts were again launched. The Minuteman launch crews were again alerted. The cause was eventually traced to a failed integrated circuit in a communications multiplexer, a component worth about 46 cents that had been incorrectly transmitting zeros as twos in a specific status message, turning a no-attack indicator into an attack indicator. These failures were not kept entirely secret. They were acknowledged, investigated, and used as the basis for technical improvements. But the fact of the improvements underscores the fact of the original failures. The systems had been operating with fault modes that could and did trigger nuclear alerts, and the only thing that had prevented those alerts from escalating was the presence, at each stage, of humans who applied judgment that the system could not. What the Cold War actually was at the operational level was a continuous negotiation between institutional systems that had been designed to function automatically and the humans inside those systems who could not quite bring themselves to do so. Every time the system produced an output that someone, somewhere, chose to question before escalating, the catastrophe was avoided. And the reason someone was in a position to question the output at all was not a design feature. It was a residual human presence in a system that was actively being designed to minimize it. The drive toward automation in nuclear command and control was not irrational. It was, in its own terms, entirely logical. Human beings are slow. They make mistakes under stress. They are susceptible to fear, to confusion, to competing loyalties. A retaliatory strike that depended entirely on human decision-making at every level was vulnerable to the possibility that the humans required to make those decisions might be killed or incapacitated before they could act. The more you automated, the more you guaranteed the response. And guaranteeing the response was the whole point, because deterrence only works if the enemy believes your retaliation is certain. But automation introduced a different class of vulnerability. An automated system cannot distinguish between a real attack and a convincing simulation of one. It cannot apply the kind of contextual reasoning that a human being, even under extreme stress, is capable of applying. It cannot notice that 5 missiles is not a plausible first strike, or that a NATO exercise is using authentic communication procedures in ways that might look like preparation for an actual attack. Automation trades human unreliability for machine rigidity, and machine rigidity in a world of ambiguous signals and imperfect sensors is its own form of danger. The Soviets built a system in the 1980s that represented in some ways the extreme end of this logic. It was called perimeter, and it was known to Western analysts by the name they gave it, dead hand. Perimeter was designed to solve the problem of decapitation. If an American first strike destroyed Soviet leadership before it could authorize a retaliation, who would launch the response? The answer Perimeter provided was the system itself. Perimeter was a semi-automated launch control system that, under certain conditions, could authorize and execute a retaliatory nuclear strike without any surviving human in the chain of command having to give an order. It monitored seismic sensors, radiation detectors, and other instruments. If those instruments detected nuclear detonations on Soviet territory, and if communication with the normal command structure had been severed, Perimeter could, after a waiting period, launch a signal that would activate the entire Soviet strategic missile force. The key word is semi-automated. Perimeter did require a human being to activate it, a person who would be placed in a protected bunker with access to the system. But once activated, the system's continued function depended on automated processes, not human decisions. The human had already made the decision, in effect, by activating the system. What happened afterward was procedural. Perimeter was, by its designer's own description, a system built to solve the problem of human unreliability in the worst possible circumstances. And it did solve that problem, in the narrow sense that it guaranteed a retaliatory strike would happen even if everyone capable of ordering one was dead. What it did not solve was the problem of false positives, the possibility that the sensors monitoring nuclear detonations might misread a natural event or a conventional explosion or a technical malfunction as evidence of an attack that hadn't happened. The Soviets were aware of this risk. Perimeter was built with safeguards, with multiple redundant sensors and confirmation requirements. But it was also built for an environment in which ambiguity was the norm rather than the exception, in which the technical systems producing the inputs to the decision process were regularly generating false readings, and in which the time available for evaluation was measured in minutes. The existence of Perimeter was not publicly acknowledged by Russia until 1993, when a former Soviet official described it to a journalist. The American government did not formally confirm their knowledge of the system until somewhat later. The details of exactly how it worked and exactly what conditions would trigger it have never been fully disclosed. This is itself a feature of the system. A weapon of last resort is more credible as a deterrent if the enemy cannot be entirely certain about the conditions under which it will activate. Petrov's decision in September 1983 happened inside this larger architecture. It was not an isolated act. It was a single node of human judgment in a system that was simultaneously building toward less human judgment and depending on human judgment to prevent the automatic processes from doing something irreversible. But to understand what made 1983 so particularly dangerous, you have to step back further to understand the long arc of how the Cold War's operational realities had diverged from its official theory. The official theory of nuclear deterrence, as articulated by both superpowers throughout the Cold War, was based on a concept called mutual assured destruction. The acronym, MAD, was noticed and used with some frequency. The idea was straightforward. If both sides had enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other even after absorbing a first strike, neither side would launch a first strike. The retaliatory capability, the second strike, was the stabilizing mechanism. As long as both sides maintained a secure second strike capability, the deterrent would hold. This theory had a number of appealing properties. It was simple. It was self-reinforcing. It predicted that increasing nuclear arsenals, paradoxically, increased stability, because the larger the arsenal, the more survivable it was. And the more survivable it was, the more credible the second strike threat. It also had the practical virtue of being a theory that both governments could explain to their own people without revealing anything classified. The problem was that the theory described a world that neither side actually operated in. Mutual assured destruction was a doctrine. The actual operational planning documents of both superpowers described something quite different. In the United States, the Single Integrated Operational Plan, the SIOP, was the master document governing how a nuclear war would actually be fought. The SIOP was not a theory. It was a targeting list, a strike sequence, and a set of procedures. And what the SIOP described, in its various iterations from the 1960s through the 1980s, was not a second strike designed to destroy Soviet cities after absorbing an attack. It was a set of options that included preemptive attack scenarios that targeted not just cities, but military forces and command and control infrastructure. And that was built around the concept of fighting and winning a nuclear war, rather than simply retaliating after losing one. The Soviets had their own equivalent documents. Soviet military doctrine, as understood by Western analysts through intelligence reports and defector accounts, was similarly oriented toward war-fighting concepts, rather than pure deterrence. Soviet military theory, drawing on traditional Russian strategic culture and the experience of World War II, placed significant emphasis on the value of striking first if war appeared inevitable. The concept of the preemptive strike, the razrushitelny udar, appeared in Soviet military writings with a regularity that made Western analysts uncomfortable. Both sides, in other words, had official deterrence doctrines for public consumption and operational war plans that assumed a nuclear war might actually be fought. And both sides built their command and control systems, their early warning networks, and their launch protocols to support the operational plans, not the deterrence doctrine. The result was that the actual hardware and procedures of the Cold War nuclear competition were calibrated for a world in which nuclear war was something that could be initiated, prosecuted, and potentially survived, not merely threatened. This divergence between doctrine and operations had specific consequences for how the two sides designed their systems and how those systems behaved under stress. The pressure to make nuclear forces responsive, to keep them on high alert, to ensure that they could be launched quickly enough to survive a first strike, created conditions that were the operational opposite of the deliberative processes that deterrence theory assumed. A weapon that takes days to prepare for launch contributes to deterrence, but does not contribute to a war plan that might require launching in minutes. The solution was to keep forces on alert, to simplify the authorization procedures, and to reduce the time required for a launch decision to the absolute minimum. But each of those measures taken individually also reduced the margin for error. A weapon on hair-trigger alert is harder to stand down than a weapon that requires time to prepare. The Americans had faced this tension directly in the 1950s, when early strategic nuclear forces were configured in ways that gave field commanders extraordinary latitude. There were periods in the 1950s when the authority to use nuclear weapons was, in practice, delegated to relatively junior officers, not because anyone had consciously decided to delegate it, but because the command and control architecture of the time made it technically possible and operationally convenient. The Korean War had created pressures to make nuclear weapons usable, and usability required accessibility, and accessibility created situations in which the weapons could theoretically have been used by people far below the president in the constitutional chain of authority. The American government spent considerable effort in the 1960s and afterward tightening those controls, installing devices called permissive action links that required authorized codes before nuclear weapons could be armed, and establishing clearer procedures for who could authorize what under what circumstances. The effort was real, and the improvements were genuine. But they were improvements on a baseline that had been remarkably loose, and the improvements never fully resolved the underlying tension between usability and control. The Soviets faced the same tension and handled it differently. Soviet nuclear weapons custody was kept, throughout most of the Cold War, in the hands of the KGB as much as the military, a reflection of the Soviet system's deep institutional distrust of the military as a potential source of political instability. The two-key system, in which both military and party approval was required for weapons use, was designed to prevent unauthorized launches, but also created its own complications in a scenario where communication between the two sets of key holders might be disrupted. The interplay of these systems, American and Soviet, with their different failure modes and different institutional cultures, created an environment in which the probability of a nuclear exchange was not zero and was not constant. It varied with the political temperature, with the technical reliability of the sensor networks, with the decisions made by individual officers at critical moments, and with factors that no analyst could fully model, because some of them were the result of coincidences and accidents that no one had anticipated. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 is the most well-known example of a Cold War confrontation that came close to a nuclear exchange, and it is well known in part because it was visible. The world could see that the two superpowers were in a standoff, and the tension of that standoff was public in ways that were unusual for the Cold War. What is less well known is what was happening below the surface of the public confrontation. On October 27, 1962, at the height of the crisis, a Soviet submarine designated B-59 was operating in the Atlantic Ocean near the quarantine line that the United States had established around Cuba. The submarine had been out of communication with Moscow for days. Its batteries were running low, and American anti-submarine forces had been dropping practice depth charges near it to force it to surface. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, had no way of knowing whether a war had started. The submarine was carrying a nuclear torpedo, and the Soviet naval officers aboard believed they had been given the authority to use it if attacked. At the moment when Savitsky, under extreme stress, exhausted, and cut off from any higher authority, gave the order to arm the nuclear torpedo, there was a second officer on board who had authority, under the relevant Soviet procedures, to concur or dissent. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov refused to concur. He argued that they should surface and re-establish communication before taking any irreversible action. The argument was heated. Savitsky was not, by accounts of those present, in a state of calm deliberation. But Arkhipov held his position, and eventually Savitsky stood down. The submarine surfaced. The nuclear torpedo was never launched. The Cuban Missile Crisis resolved without a nuclear exchange. But the margin, on that particular afternoon, had come down to the judgment of a single officer on a submarine who could not be sure whether the world was already at war. Arkhipov's story, like Petrov's, did not become widely known until long after the events. It had the same structural features. A protocol that permitted action, a system that could not distinguish its own false positive from reality, and a human being who inserted a judgment that the system could not provide. The pattern recurred throughout the Cold War, in incidents of varying severity, at different levels of the command structure, in different countries. And the pattern was never officially acknowledged, because acknowledging it would have required admitting that the systems relied upon to prevent nuclear war were, in practice, dependent on individuals making decisions that those systems were designed to make automatic. There is a bureaucratic logic to this silence. An institution that admits its systems can fail can be held accountable for the failures. An institution that keeps the failures classified faces no such accountability. The classification of nuclear near-misses was not simply about security. It was about institutional survival. Governments, military establishments, and defense agencies had spent enormous amounts of money and political capital on the nuclear deterrent systems they had built. Acknowledging that those systems had come close to triggering the catastrophe they were supposed to prevent would have called into question the legitimacy of the entire enterprise. The systems were therefore described, in public, as reliable. The incidents in which they had nearly failed were classified, sometimes for decades. The officers who had made the decisions that prevented those failures were either ignored or, in some cases, sanctioned for the bureaucratic irregularities their crisis behavior had generated, because following protocols under stress matters to institutions even when the protocols themselves are the problem. Petrov's reassignment was consistent with this pattern. He had not followed procedure. He had not filed the paperwork correctly. He had made a decision that was not his to make, according to the system's design. The fact that his decision had almost certainly prevented a catastrophic escalation was, institutionally, beside the point. The system was not designed to reward deviation. The system was designed to reward compliance. The question of whether Petrov's deviation was right, in some larger moral or strategic sense, is one that the Cold War's official history was not equipped to answer, because the Cold War's official history was itself a product of institutional silence. What the historical record shows, to the extent that it has been reconstructed, is that the gap between what the systems were designed to do and what actually prevented catastrophe was, repeatedly and consistently, filled by human beings who did not follow the protocols. That observation is uncomfortable for several reasons. It suggests that the protocols were not simply procedures, but were, in certain scenarios, part of the problem. It suggests that the training and selection processes that produced the officers staffing these systems were producing people who were, at critical moments, more capable of sound judgment than the systems they were supposed to operate. And it suggests that the stability of the nuclear balance during the Cold War was, to an uncomfortable degree, a matter of luck. Luck that the right person was at the console. Luck that the false alarm happened during a period of relative calm rather than during a genuine crisis. Luck that the submarine officer who refused to arm the torpedo held his position long enough. The Cuban Missile Crisis itself, which is often cited as evidence that the deterrence system worked, was in fact evidence of something more equivocal. The crisis was resolved partly through negotiations, partly through private understandings about missile deployments in Turkey that were never publicly acknowledged, and partly through the actions of individuals, on both sides, who made decisions that were not fully sanctioned by the institutional frameworks around them. The resolution was not the system working as designed. The resolution was people improvising under conditions that the system had not anticipated. The question of how much weight to put on human judgment in a nuclear command and control system is one that defense establishments on both sides wrestled with continuously throughout the Cold War, without ever arriving at a stable answer. The tension between reliability and safety, between launch responsiveness and false alarm protection, was built into the physics of ballistic missiles and the politics of nuclear deterrence in ways that no technical solution could fully resolve. In the 1970s and 1980s, there were American strategists who argued for moving away from the launch-on-warning posture entirely, for accepting that a Soviet first strike might destroy a portion of the American retaliatory force in exchange for the confidence that came from waiting until there was definitive evidence of an attack before launching. The argument had strategic merit, but it ran directly against the institutional interests of the services responsible for maintaining and operating the nuclear forces. A posture that accepted destruction of some weapons was a posture that justified having fewer weapons, and fewer weapons meant smaller budgets, smaller commands, less institutional significance. The nuclear arsenals of both superpowers grew throughout the Cold War, not primarily because of strategic requirements, though strategic arguments were always offered, but because of institutional dynamics, the preferences of military services for larger rather than smaller forces, the interests of defense contractors, the political incentives of legislators in states with major defense industries, and the momentum of a technological competition that had achieved its own bureaucratic logic, independent of the strategic rationale that had originally driven it. By the early 1980s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had nuclear arsenals that were, by any reasonable strategic analysis, far larger than required for deterrence. The United States had thousands of deliverable warheads. The Soviet Union had more. The theoretical stability of mutual assured destruction, which required only that each side have a survivable second strike capability, did not require thousands of weapons. It required far fewer. The excess weapons were not strategic assets. They were institutional artifacts, the accumulated product of decades of competition in which the institutional incentives were always to add rather than subtract. The excess created its own operational problems. Managing thousands of weapons, maintaining them, securing them, training the personnel responsible for them, integrating them into operational plans, required an organizational infrastructure of staggering complexity. And complex organizations generate errors. They generate miscommunications. They generate the kind of procedural failures that, in a non-nuclear context, produce embarrassments and occasional accidents, and in a nuclear context, produce false alarms at NORAD and ambiguous satellite readings at Serpukhov 15. The organizational complexity of the Cold War nuclear enterprise was never adequately communicated to the public, and not only because it was classified. It was also because the complexity was itself a form of argument. Systems this complex cannot be wrong, cannot fail, cannot trigger a catastrophe by accident. The complexity was presented as a safeguard when it was also, simultaneously, a source of risk. The people who worked inside these systems understood both dimensions. The people who designed them often recognized at some level that they were designing around a fundamental impossibility. A weapon that would absolutely work when needed and absolutely not work when not needed. Deployed in an environment where need was a matter of interpretation, and where the time available for interpretation was, by design, minimal. The workarounds they developed were not technical solutions. They were procedural accommodations, checklists, confirmation procedures, two-man rules requiring two independent authorizations for any action, physical separation of the components required to arm a weapon. These procedures added friction to the launch process. They reduced the probability of an accidental launch by a single error. But they also added complexity, and complexity added failure modes, and every failure mode was a new path through which something could go wrong. The two-man rule, for instance, was designed to prevent a single individual from having the ability to launch a nuclear weapon unilaterally. But the two-man rule required communication between the two individuals, and communication systems could be disrupted, and disrupted communication in a nuclear context was ambiguous. It could mean the communication system had failed, or it could mean that the command infrastructure had been destroyed in a first strike. The system had to have a rule about how to handle disrupted communication. And that rule was another design choice that traded one type of risk for another. Every layer of the command and control architecture had this character. Every safeguard created a new vulnerability. Every redundancy introduced a new failure mode. The system was not getting safer with each improvement. It was getting more complex. And complexity and safety are not the same thing. The people responsible for the system understood this. There is substantial documentation in the records of American strategic planning that have been declassified, of officials arguing internally that certain procedures were too risky, that certain weapons were too vulnerable, that certain alert postures were too dangerous. These arguments were heard, were sometimes acted upon, and were sometimes overridden by institutional pressures that had nothing to do with safety. One of the most revealing examples involves the Minuteman ICBM force and its alert posture. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, American strategic planners debated how to handle the fact that land-based ICBMs were becoming increasingly vulnerable to Soviet counterforce strikes. The missiles sat in fixed silos, and as Soviet accuracy improved, the probability that a Soviet first strike could destroy a significant fraction of the American ICBM force increased. The response, from a deterrence perspective, was to either make the missiles less vulnerable or to increase confidence in their survivability by keeping them ready to launch before an incoming attack could arrive. The practical consequence of the latter approach was to shorten the decision timelines and to increase the pressure on the early warning systems and the officers monitoring them to produce accurate, timely information, which meant that false alarms in the early warning network had greater potential consequences than they would have had in a less responsive posture. The very measure taken to preserve the deterrent in the face of increasing Soviet accuracy was also a measure that made false alarm scenarios more dangerous. No one made this choice carelessly. The documents show serious people working through difficult trade-offs with genuine concern for consequences. But the institutional incentives were not aligned with the analytical conclusions. The services wanted their weapons, the planners wanted their targets covered, the politicians wanted their postures maintained, and the analysts' warning about false alarm risks were working against a background assumption that the system would generally work correctly, because if the system might not work correctly, you would need to reconsider the entire enterprise, and reconsidering the entire enterprise was not on anyone's institutional agenda. Stanislav Petrov was not a famous man before the details of September 26, 1983 became known. He was a competent technical officer in a large military bureaucracy, occupying a specific node in a system that was too complex for any single person to fully understand. What he understood on that night was the specific part of the system he was responsible for, and what that specific understanding told him in the minutes after the alarm sounded was that something was wrong. He later described the decision process in terms that were notably undramatic. He did not describe a heroic choice, a moment of moral clarity, a decision to put humanity above institutional obligation. He described a technical assessment, a series of observations about the data in front of him, and a judgment that the data did not support the conclusion the system was reporting. He was, by his own account, uncertain. He did not know he was right. He knew only that he was not confident enough in the system's output to treat it as confirmed, and that treating an unconfirmed alarm as confirmed had consequences that were not reversible. That uncertainty is important. It is easy, in retrospect, to describe Petrov's decision as obviously correct because we know he was right. But in the moment, he did not know. He was making a probabilistic judgment under extreme time pressure, against the institutional weight of a system that was telling him to do something different. The fact that his judgment was sound does not mean that the same judgment would always be sound in the same circumstances, or that the next person in his position would make the same call. What the Petrov incident actually illustrates is not the reliability of human judgment. What it illustrates is the unreliability of systems that depend on the occasional insertion of exceptional human judgment to prevent catastrophic errors, while being structurally designed to minimize ordinary human judgment in the interest of speed and reliability. The Cold War's nuclear infrastructure was, in this sense, a system that worked by accumulating unspent catastrophes, crises that came close enough to disaster to reveal the system's fragility, but not close enough to actually produce the disaster. And the accumulation of near misses did not, by itself, improve the system. Each near miss was classified. Each classification prevented the near miss from becoming a lesson that could be applied publicly to the design of better systems. Each lesson that couldn't be applied publicly remained available only to the small group of insiders who knew about it, and those insiders were operating inside institutions whose primary incentive was to maintain confidence in the existing systems rather than to publicize their failure modes. The institutionalization of secrecy around nuclear near misses was not a conspiracy. It was the natural behavior of organizations protecting themselves. But its consequences were real. It prevented a public reckoning with the actual risk profile of the deterrent system. It insulated the system from the kind of external scrutiny that might have produced better safety practices. And it meant that the lessons of individual incidents like Petrov's were absorbed slowly, partially, and without the public accountability that might have generated real change. The declassification of documents in the 1990s and afterward, and the personal accounts of participants who chose to speak publicly, have made it possible to reconstruct something closer to the actual history. But the reconstruction is still incomplete, because many documents remain classified, because key participants are dead, because the institutional incentives that produced the original secrecy have not entirely disappeared, And because governments on both sides continue to have reasons to avoid full acknowledgement of how close the nuclear competition came to producing the outcome it was supposed to prevent. What can be said with confidence is this. Between the early 1950s and the end of the Cold War in 1991, the United States and the Soviet Union came close to a nuclear exchange on multiple occasions. Some of those occasions were the result of political crises, confrontations in which the escalation dynamics of the adversarial relationship pushed both sides toward the boundary of what was manageable. Others were the result of technical failures in the early warning systems, sensor malfunctions, computer errors, procedural mistakes that produced false alarms, serious enough to trigger alert responses before being identified and corrected. A few were the result of human errors at critical nodes in the command structure, mistakes made by individuals under extreme stress who were operating with incomplete information and inadequate decision time. And some were the result of accidents and coincidences that no one had anticipated and that fell outside the categories that the system's designers had built it to handle. In every case, the outcome was the same: no launch. And in every case, the factors that prevented a launch were different from the factors that the system's designers had primarily relied upon. They were not primarily the result of the deterrent system working as designed. They were primarily the result of human beings, often acting against or outside of their formal protocols, applying judgment that the system's automated processes could not. The Petrov incident is the most thoroughly documented of these moments, partly because Petrov himself was eventually willing to discuss it publicly, and partly because Russian archival releases in the 1990s made some corroborating documentation available. But it is not unique. It sits within a long series of similar moments, each one the result of a particular combination of circumstance and individual choice, none of them guaranteed to come out the same way if repeated. The Soviet military's response to the incident, the reassignment, the reprimand for administrative failure, the institutional silence, was not surprising. It was consistent with how militaries handle cases in which someone in the system behaved correctly by behaving incorrectly according to the system's own standards. The system could not reward Petrov without implicitly acknowledging that the system's protocols in this case had been wrong, and acknowledging that was something the institution was not willing to do. The specific nature of Petrov's deviation also tells you something about the relationship between formal protocols and actual safety. Petrov's deviation was not large. He did not take a dramatic unilateral action. He did not disable any weapons or change any operational parameters. What he did, in institutional terms, was fail to escalate. He received an alarm that the protocol said to relay upward, and he chose not to relay it as confirmed. That is the totality of what he did. The difference between following the protocol and deviating from it was a single decision about a single message. The consequence of that single decision, if the false alarm had been escalated, is unknowable. Perhaps the command structure above Petrov would have identified the alarm as a technical error and stood down. Perhaps the corroborating radar data, or lack thereof, would have been sufficient to abort the escalation before it produced an irreversible decision. Perhaps the chain of command would have functioned exactly as designed, and the false alarm would have been correctly identified at a higher level. Perhaps not. The record of how the Soviet command structure performed under stress in the actual crises of the Cold War does not provide unambiguous grounds for confidence in any of those outcomes. The record shows, instead, an institution that was managing its way through conditions of profound uncertainty, sometimes effectively, sometimes not, always without the kind of reliable information about the adversary's intentions that the theoretical models of deterrence assumed. One of the things that September 1983 illustrates in particular is how the specific political context of any given moment can transform a technical problem into a strategic crisis. A satellite sensor malfunction in September 1983 was more dangerous than the same malfunction would have been in 1975, because in September 1983 the political temperature was higher, because the Ryan program had produced an institutional expectation of American aggression, because the Cal 007 incident had sharpened the adversarial dynamic, because NATO was about to deploy Pershing missiles and Able Archer was 2 months away. The same technical failure at a different moment would have been resolved in the same way, but without the same stakes. This context dependence of nuclear risk is one of the factors that makes historical reconstruction difficult and prospective analysis even harder. The risk is not constant. It varies with political conditions, with the state of the technical systems, with the individuals occupying key positions at key moments, with factors that are not visible in advance and often not visible in retrospect. The Cold War's nuclear standoff was not a steady state. It was a dynamic system, and its stability was the result of a continuous interaction between the system's structure and the events that the system was responding to. The period around 1983 was, by most assessments, one of the more dangerous periods of the Cold War, and not primarily for the reasons that were publicly visible at the time. The public drama of the Pershing deployment, the rhetoric between Washington and Moscow, the Cal 007 aftermath. These were the visible symptoms of a deeper instability in the relationship, an instability that manifested most dangerously in the operational characteristics of the two sides' nuclear forces and command systems. What made 1983 dangerous was not the possibility of a deliberate nuclear war. Neither side was preparing to launch a deliberate first strike. What made 1983 dangerous was the possibility of an inadvertent escalation, a sequence of events in which miscommunication, technical failure, or misread intentions produced a response that the other side interpreted as aggression, which produced a further response, which continued to escalate until it was no longer possible to stop. This scenario did not require either side to want a nuclear war. It required only that the systems, at some point, stop producing outputs that the humans inside them could distinguish from reality. Petrov's moment was a moment in which the system nearly stopped producing distinguishable outputs. The satellite had interpreted a reflection as a launch. The software had processed the reflection as a confirmed event. The alarm had sounded with a severity that protocol demanded be treated as a real attack. Everything the system was designed to do, it did. The only step it could not take was to evaluate whether what it was detecting was actually what it appeared to be, because that kind of evaluation requires a form of contextual reasoning that automated systems could not yet perform. What Petrov provided, in that moment, was exactly the contextual reasoning the system lacked. He knew that 5 missiles was not a plausible first strike. He knew that the OCO system had characteristics that made certain false alarm modes more likely under certain conditions. He knew that the current geopolitical situation, as serious as it was, did not correspond to a moment when the United States would logically choose to initiate a nuclear exchange with 5 missiles. He applied that knowledge against the system's output and reached a different conclusion. That conclusion was correct. But the reasoning that produced it was not the kind of reasoning that can be institutionalized easily, because it depended on a particular person having a particular combination of technical knowledge and strategic understanding, operating in a particular moment with a particular willingness to trust his own judgment against the systems. Remove any of those elements, and the decision might have gone differently. The structural problem that Petrov's incident exposed was not new in 1983. The tension between human judgment and automated systems in nuclear command and control had been recognized and debated since the early days of the nuclear age. The arguments on both sides were genuine, and the trade-offs were real, but the institutional pressures had generally favored automation over judgment, speed over deliberation, reliability of response over safety of process. The result was a set of systems in which human judgment was the fallback, the emergency override, the thing you used when the system failed, rather than the primary mechanism. The problem with using human judgment as a fallback in a system designed to minimize it is that the conditions under which the fallback is needed are exactly the conditions under which human judgment is hardest to exercise well. High stress, minimal information, extreme time pressure, and institutional weight pushing strongly toward a specific action. Petrov's performance under those conditions was exceptional. The question that the Cold War's history raises and does not answer is how often the performance was not exceptional and what the consequences were. The declassified record suggests that the performance was sometimes not exceptional, that there were moments when errors were made and escalations occurred that were later managed back down by other processes, or that simply terminated without incident because the adversary's response happened to be appropriate. The record also suggests that there were moments that have not been declassified, events that remain in sealed archives or personal memories, whose consequences were contained, but whose full details are not known. This is the nature of the historical problem. The events we know about are the ones that produce some kind of documentation, an official report, a personal account, an archival record. The events that produced no documentation, or whose documentation has not been released, are invisible. And among the events that are invisible, it is impossible to know how many were serious, how many were trivial, and how many fell somewhere in between. What the visible events tell us with considerable confidence is that the nuclear systems of the Cold War operated with a level of risk that was substantially higher than was officially acknowledged, and that the risk was not uniformly distributed across time. It concentrated in periods of political tension, in moments when technical systems were undergoing changes, in situations where communication between the two sides was limited or distorted, and in instances where the gap between what the systems were detecting and what was actually happening in the world was large enough to permit dangerous misinterpretation. September and October of 1983 was such a period. The combination of the Ryan program's alarming assessments, the post-Cal Euro 7 political environment, the Petrov incident, and the Able Archer exercise created a cluster of risks that, in retrospect, represents one of the closest approaches to an inadvertent nuclear war in the Cold War's history. The fact that each individual risk was managed, resolved, or simply survived does not change the character of the period. It changes only the outcome. The management of nuclear risk in the Cold War was not a triumph of planning. It was a sustained improvisation. The plans existed, and they were followed to the extent that they could be, but the plans were designed for a strategic environment that was simpler than the actual strategic environment, and the gap between the plan and the environment was filled continuously by people making judgment calls that the plan had not anticipated. Petrov was one of those people. He was not the only one. He was not even in some ways the most consequential one, because the consequences of what he did were contingent on what the chain of command above him would have done with the information he chose not to provide. He prevented a process from starting. Whether that process, if started, would have terminated catastrophically or would have been stopped by other judgment calls further up the chain is a question that cannot be answered. What can be said is that he made a choice that was not the choice the system expected him to make, and that the choice was, by most available evidence, the correct one. He made it under conditions that would test anyone's capacity for sound judgment, in an institution that was not designed to support or reward the kind of reasoning he applied, at a moment when the political environment gave maximum weight to any evidence of American aggression, and against the specific technical output of a system that he himself had helped design. The subsequent handling of the incident, the official silence, the administrative reprimand, the reassignment, tells you something important about the institutions that operated the Cold War's nuclear systems. They were not designed to learn from the incidents that Petrov's case represents. They were designed to maintain confidence in the system's reliability, and maintaining that confidence required not publicizing the system's failure modes. The institutional logic was coherent. The institutional logic was also, from the perspective of someone trying to understand and improve the actual safety of the systems, deeply counterproductive. The Cold War ended not because the deterrent systems became safe or the institutional failures were corrected. It ended because one side's political and economic system collapsed under pressures that had been building for decades, producing a dissolution of the Soviet Union that no one in the Western intelligence community had predicted with any precision, and that no one in the Soviet political establishment had planned for. The weapons did not disappear. The systems that managed them did not disappear. The operational postures that had produced the false alarms and near misses of the Cold War decades did not disappear. The perimeter system continued to exist after 1991. The PSYOP continued to be revised after 1991. The early warning satellites on both sides continued to monitor each other's territory after 1991. The command and control systems continued to function and to malfunction, and to be staffed by officers who had been trained in the same institutional culture that had produced Petrov and the protocol he deviated from. What changed after 1991 was the political temperature, the administrative context in which those systems operated. The Ryan program was discontinued. The Able Archer-style exercises were redesigned. Communication between the two governments improved. These changes reduced the risk profile in ways that were real and meaningful, but they did not change the fundamental character of the systems themselves, the automated processes, the launch protocols, the sensor networks, the operational postures that had been built for a different political environment and that remained in place long after that environment had changed. The nuclear arsenals of Russia and the United States remained, after the Cold War, at levels far above what any strategic analysis would identify as necessary for deterrence. The reductions that occurred under various arms control treaties were genuine but partial, leaving both sides with thousands of warheads deployed and thousands more in reserve. The command and control systems that had generated the false alarms and near misses of the Cold War were modified but not fundamentally redesigned. The institutional cultures that had classified those near misses and resisted learning from them were reformed but not replaced. The world that Stanislav Petrov was born into in 1939 was a world that had already been reshaped once by industrial-scale killing of a kind that previous generations could not have imagined. The world he worked in, as a young officer in the Soviet military, was a world in the process of building systems capable of ending human civilization in an afternoon. The world he made his choice in September 1983, was a world in which the systems designed to prevent that outcome and the systems designed to ensure it were, in some scenarios, the same systems. And the world he died in 2017, was a world that had reduced but not eliminated the inventory of those weapons, that had improved but not resolved the institutional failures that produced the incidents he had lived through, and that had acknowledged, partially and belatedly, the significance of what he had done on a September night 34 years before. The systems that sustained the Cold War did not end with it. They adapted to it. They are still there.